I'm honored to be here with Indigo because I met her when she was writing a piece about Lockheed Martin's influence over universities. And since I wrote a book about them, I'm supposed to keep up on it, so I had a personal interest. But also, the article was solid, and I actually used it to set up my chapter of my new book about the increasing role of Pentagon contractors in the Pentagon at universities. So, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So you can just fire a question, or I can do a brief, whatever you want.
Yeah, I know we're here to talk about your book, but I wanted to start with Iran. I don't think we can just simply say that it's this trillion-dollar war machine that's pushing us to go to war. Like, if Biden were president, we wouldn't be in this situation right now. So I was just wondering if you could talk to us about the special interests pushing this war, where it came from, what you understand to be Trump's thinking on what it's going to look like, and so forth.
Trump's thinking.
If he is thinking.
That's a mind I would not want to inhabit. Well, I've been saying that it's partly the flailing of a declining empire. It's partly certainly special interests, but also he's pathological. I don't think he calculates these things. I think he maybe thought that he was going to bomb Iran and they were going to capitulate. And now he's started a Mideast-wide war, which even Bush couldn't manage in Iraq. So I was in Montana to speak to 500 high school students about nuclear nonproliferation. And I was a little concerned because the biggest employer in Montana is an intercontinental ballistic missile base. And they have a MAGA governor. And I was like, well, how am I going to start this? And by the time I got there in the talk, they had started the war. Trump said they were about to strike us with a nuclear weapon, even though last year he said he had completely obliterated their program. And of course, there was an agreement that had blocked them, which he shredded because he said he could do better. So I walked through the students this. I said, does this seem better to you? A Mideast war versus an agreement. And they didn't think so. So now, I'm supposed to be a respectable think tanker. Even we're a blazer. But I'm increasingly, it's hard for me to stick to that kind of antiseptic rhetoric because I'm so angry about what's happening. And so, I'm getting away with it so far, But I do think the contractors they're seizing this to make money. In fact, there was an analysis that about 70% of the $1 billion a day that they're spending on this war is munitions, the missiles and bombs and interceptors. And there's a handful of companies that make them, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. An interceptor costs $12 million each, cruise missile $2 million each, often shooting down drones that cost $10,000. And they had a meeting at the White House with the heads of the arms companies. They said they're going to quadruple their production of these things. Well, how about not arming genocide, not starting unnecessary wars? Then you wouldn't run out of these things, correct? But they want to supersize our arms industry. And once you do that, the members where those plants are built are not going to let you close them. So we have to head that off. And I think a lot of the press coverage is sort of like a horse race. It's like, well, is Trump going to win? How could you possibly win when you're starting a Mideast-wide war? You're bombing elementary schools. There's people running out of hospitals with babies in incubators. And also, who's going to make an agreement with us after we shredded the Iran agreement and we and the Israelis killed their leaders? They're not thinking ahead, to put it mildly. And I think bullying and corruption is not a foreign policy. But apparently they're not aware of this, because this is going to affect not just the people that oppose Trump, but his supporters, the generations to come. It's such a narrow view of the world that it's almost stunning to me.
I'm old enough to remember the New York Times publishing an op-ed by John Bolton that said, "To stop Iran's bombs, bomb Iran." I was wondering if you could talk about the media's role in manufacturing consent for these kind of wars, and Iran in particular.
John Bolton makes me pull my hair out. He was the guy behind the Iraq war, and now he's a hero because he thinks you should count the votes. I'm not buying it. I remember one day I woke up, Bolton was in the Washington Post and the New York Times at the same time. So those of us who opposed the Iraq War have been dismissed. The people who supported it are now the talking heads on television. And a lot of it is who they choose to interview. A lot of them work at think tanks that are funded by contractors. And, well, I was on CNN once, and back when Chris Cuomo hadn't been disgraced yet, and they were giving me maybe 3 to 5 minutes. They didn't tell me there was going to be this general on there. So he called me a terrorist sympathizer. But you can't respond. You only got 5 minutes, So I said, oh, that's frivolous, and I said my thing. And then Cuomo said, this is early in the first Trump, like 3 months in. He says, President Trump says he's rebuilt the military. Is that true? I said, he hasn't submitted a budget yet. So no, it's not true. And I would have thought the head of a major news outlet would be aware of this, or at least his researchers. So this is where we're at. And even MSNBC, although they're critical, I would like to see them interviewing organizers who are trying to change this and not just being upset about them saying nasty things. I think that's been established. And also they're just cutting back. A lot of papers don't have a Pentagon reporter anymore. And so they rely on the industry-funded press, and now they're being laid off. So we had a whole 20th anniversary piece about the coverage of the Iraq War, and we had the journalists who got it right. And they said, their editor said, look, we're in these smaller cities. The New York Times represents the people that send kids to war. We represent the people whose kids are sent to war. And they did basic journalism, like they didn't take it from the top. They talked to people in the bureaucracy. They had multiple sources. But they were at Knight Ridder, which has not got the same soapbox as the Times or the Washington Post. And the conclusion of that was that you can only improve the mainstream media so much. My idea of a success is this kind of pro-war article, paragraph 32. Oh yeah, there's this guy, Bill Hartung, he thinks something different. Like that's not really enough. But there's plenty of sources that go deeper, but people need to know about them. They have to tell, nonsense from reality. There's a lot of work to be done. But if we're gonna, I think, unravel all this, we need longer treatments. And also I think we need to meet people in person, because if you can kind of get what their questions are, go a little deeper, as opposed to just, having them taken in propaganda, you can make a little more, of a dent. And a lot of even Trump supporters are going to be hurt by this, but of course he's going to want them to blame it on immigrants or Antifa, which I'm not sure even exists anymore. So there's work to be done, but I think it can be done.
Yeah, you mentioned public education as an important tool in turning all of this around. And I was wondering, what does that look like outside of as important as think tankers like yourself are? What does that look like outside of think tanks like Quincy? What does a solid public education movement look like?
Well, I'm a little different from the average Quincyite because I'm not a creature of DC. I've never lived there. I grew up in a small Republican town outside of Buffalo, and my goal was to leave, which I did. And most of my research came in conjunction with organizing. I took a semester to work on the United Farm Workers boycott. I was part of a magazine called Southern Africa that followed the liberation movements, and my beat was who's breaking the arms embargo, which multinationals are propping up the regime. So that was much more valuable to me than my degree at Columbia, the place that now is, of course, protecting their students from free speech. And then the one course that was valuable is Seymour Melman, The Permanent War Economy of the United States. And so that, of course, made an impression. But I think in that sense, I've always wanted to be communicating to a broad audience. And we have an expert in our think tank who was offered to do an op-ed for the New York Times, and he said no. And then our communications person's head exploded. And then we had endless meetings. And all the editor wanted was what are 3 points you want to make? And they sent him an 1,800 word, exposition for what was going to be a 700 word article. So there's a certain notion of if you have the right analysis, all will follow. And wouldn't that be nice, right? I mean, what if good ideas won out without special interests, without lies, without conspiracy theories? But I kind of learned after some hard lessons that is not the case. but also that, a lot of my talks used to be like painting a picture of the power of the military-industrial complex. And people say, God, you're right, Bill. I'm going to go home and go to the beach. I can't deal with these people. So you really need to nurture the stories about victories that we've had, about people who stand up against incredible odds. And I think you need to build community so that doing this is rewarding, not just kind of, a bunch of Eeyores. And I think it can be done. Certainly in the civil rights movement, when people got arrested, they would sing freedom songs, in jail. And the farm workers had a street theater, Teatro Campesino. It was because it's a long fight, I think we need, to nurture a community and sort of take joy in the struggle, which is very difficult to think about at a time like this. I mean, when the war starts, we have the least traction, and destruction moves much more quickly than organizing. And so this is one of the more painful times in this cycle. And of course, we need to, get at the root of it. When Dr. King gave his speech at Riverside Church against the Vietnam War, which the New York Times, viciously attacked for him getting out of his lane, he said, if we don't get at the root of this, racism, materialism, militarism, we're going to be having committees against the war in Vietnam and Peru and for the next generation. And to some degree, that has happened. So somehow, in addition to when we're fighting the latest outrage, we somehow have to chip away at this war machine, which basically, if you're spending $1 trillion, you're more likely to go to war, especially because they just destroyed our economic assistance program. They're depopulating the State Department. This is almost, Donald Trump's mouth and weapons are almost all they have left,
You've also mentioned that we're not just battling, better arguments aren't just going to win out because we're making better arguments, and we're not just dealing with the traditional news media. You mention extensively in your book different cultural aspects that are also kind of brainwashing the public about what the Pentagon is and what national security means. Things like Hollywood and the video game industry and universities. I was wondering if you could talk about how some of those cultural aspects also help shape the public's perception of the Pentagon.
Yeah, I didn't know much about this. And my co-author, Ben Freeman, is a geriatric millennial, which means he's kind of almost at the edge of that. He's 44, which to me seems like really young. But we did a chapter on Hollywood, and the Pentagon has a liaison office in Hollywood. And if you want to use one of their weapons, they get script control. And so it's not just Top Gun, it's all the Marvel movies. I've seen half a Marvel movie when I was bored in a hotel room. Ben has seen all of them, he loves them, but he also understands that they're working on us. There's one that features a female pilot, and after that, the recruitment of women to the Air Force went up substantially. And of course, if you have a weapon that doesn't work in real life, it's brilliant in the movies, and they've approved like many scripts. There was a movie of Orwell's 1984, and for some reason there was a weapon in it, and the Pentagon changed the ending of 1984. I don't know what they changed it to, but it's much more pervasive. There's a guy at University of Georgia who follows this stuff, and then the gaming industry, of course, the technology came from the Pentagon, but now the companies have better technology. The Pentagon's buying it back. And they did a study after 9/11. Everybody's like, oh, these kids now, they don't go outside, they're slackers, all they do is play video games. Pentagon said, that is great. They're multitaskers. They actually consult gamers about how to design the controls for drone strikes. And the Army has a team that competes in esports with civilians, which is one of their big recruiting tools. They're kind of selling the idea that, it's just a game. And one of the biggest militarists from Silicon Valley, this guy Palmer Luckey, who's like a gamer with a soul patch and a Hawaiian shirt, who decided to get into weapons. He's funding games that didn't make it. He wants all those games to be made. And by one account, he's got an abandoned missile silo where he puts CD-ROMs of games that he likes. And Musk, apparently, when they were building the the spaceship, they would play video games for 4 hours in the middle of the night, and they sort of had to let them win, of course. So all this stuff is like reality and violence are all kind of mixed together. Two of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley, Anduril and Palantir, are named after objects in Lord of the Rings. One of them is a sword, the other is the stone that senses things. And there's even Trekkies who are so excited about colonizing space, they're willing to put anything up there. So it's kind of mind-bending. I mean, they also use the game stuff for simulation and training. And one of the guys at the Pentagon said, yeah, we got to be more like Disney. So it's just like my idea was like they're lobbying, they're doing job blackmail, and this other cultural aspect, Ben really went deep. And it's a little scary.
I want to talk about Silicon Valley a little bit. I don't know if you saw this big New York Times editorial series. It was multiple articles about how the armed forces is falling behind in the global position to China, and we can't keep up, and we have these sophisticated, expensive weapons that aren't necessarily tailored for fighting modern wars in 2026. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's wrong with the way our armed forces is set up and how Silicon Valley is promising to fix it and whether they actually will.
Well, the first thing that's wrong is we use them for the wrong purposes. Endless war, intervene anywhere. I call it the cover the globe strategy, which used to be an ad for paint. But, if you're going to go anywhere, fight any battle, you need a big military. And if you have a big military, soldiers have to be fed, they need uniforms, they need weapons, they need health care. So a lot of people say, if we just cut waste, we could reduce the Pentagon budget. We have to change the purpose of the armed forces to be defensive. And of course, Pete Hegseth wants them all to be warriors and relish killing people, which is not what it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be a reluctant warrior who's defending the Constitution, not a bloodthirsty white Christian nationalist who's loyal to Donald Trump. I think Hegseth's idea of a good military would be if the Michigan militia was in better shape and had better weapons, So there's that. But also, they try to do the impossible, like Golden Dome, which is supposed to be a perfect missile shield. Well, Reagan said the same thing, and they couldn't even do a successful test because a ballistic missile comes in at 15,000 miles an hour. And in space, you can paint a bunch of balloons. They look just the same as a warhead. And if there's multiple of them, you can't possibly block them all. In fact, the American Physical Society said to even have a chance, you'd need hundreds of interceptors for every warhead, which is not happening. And a guy at the Conservative American Enterprise Institute said to even give it a fair try, they'd have to spend $3.6 trillion over the next 3 decades. So they're wasting money on that, and then they're saying they're short of funds for artillery shells, And then the things they build, they're exquisite, they're complicated, they're sitting in the hangar half the time, which is, I guess, a form of disarmament, but not necessarily the best way. And also, when the Pentagon tries to get rid of something, Congress says no. There was this thing called the Littoral Combat Ship, which the Navy decided, you have to buy more ships just to defend the thing. It's not doing what it wants. They wanted to retire it. But the congressmen from Florida and Virginia, where they fixed the things, said no. They wouldn't let them get rid of them. So the Pentagon budget's kind of like, it's like looking at sedimentary rock, because nothing ever goes away. They just keep adding. But the idea was, well, the tech folks are going to be different. They're going to be more competitive, more nimble. In fact, Palmer Luckey hired a guy to write this manifesto about everything that's wrong with Lockheed Martin. So I took offense because, I'm an expert on that. But I thought I was not to go on CNN anymore. But anyway, they said, well, they don't understand software. They charge too much. We'll be more nimble. Our weapons will be, they call it attritable, which only the Pentagon could say. But if you're in a war and your drones are getting wiped out, they can produce new ones more quickly. So they're kind of selling themselves as kind of the reformers, and they get a lot of their money from venture capital. So the Pentagon doesn't put in money up front. But once they've got the monopoly, you know they're going to charge us an arm and a leg. And also they're bragging about things that don't exist, capabilities that don't exist. They're not telling us how they're going to build these things, how they're going to test them. And also they all happen to be unhinged. You know, Peter Thiel wants to live forever. Musk wants to colonize space. And I would not want to be in space with him or live forever with Peter Thiel. That would be my idea of hell. But they're putting energy into this. In fact, Thiel has a little ungoverned space in Honduras where they're doing experiments. I don't know if he's going to upload them, exactly how he's going to do it. But so they think they can do anything. And they also think there are saviors. The head of Palantir has a book called The Technological Republic. And he said, you know, Americans are soft. We don't have a unified national mission. We just watch reality TV and play games. And so he came up with a mission, which was a new Manhattan Project to apply AI to military purposes. And I was like, really? This is the mission of our country? I mean, that is such an impoverished vision of what human beings should be able to accomplish. And yet he said this with a straight face in this book that was on the bestseller list. They also, one of the ideologists, a woman named Catherine Boyle, wrote an article. They call themselves founders, like they're the founding fathers or something. And she says, what does it take to make a founder? It's the God-given understanding that there's a problem that only you can solve. So they're kind of like, it's almost like a secular religion, except they're worshiping themselves, and they want us to make them rich at the same time. So they're dangerous people. When I didn't know a lot about this till we started the book, but I think their vision of the world is almost as dangerous as the technology. And of course, J.D. Vance was groomed in Silicon Valley. And as soon as he was made VP, that's when the money poured in from Musk and Thiel and all these folks. And they want to have, you know, artificial intelligence be the wave of the future. But amazingly, they're not getting rid of anything else. So for example, Golden Dome, the hardware will be Lockheed Martin, the software will be Palmer Luckey, and they'll all get rich. So, you know, some of my colleagues are like, well, you know, if you're going to break the monopoly of the big companies, these are the only people who can do it. Fine. I would say if they have something that works, we would buy it. But they would be vendors. They wouldn't be trying to run our government, our foreign policy, what it means to be human. They just, you know, if you got something that works, we'll consider it. But stay in your lane, you know. And so that, unfortunately, there's a lot of people love tech. And, you know, I know a lot of people who think Elon Musk is some sort of god because unlike Donald Trump, his companies make stuff, you know. So I think it's tough because this is going to, you know, this technology is going to be introduced, but it's got to be limited as to how it's used, and they can't trust it for everything. I mean, I barely know how electricity works, but I do know that complex software fails, and they're making it more and more complex. So these folks need to be regulated, just like the big companies should be regulated, but they want to get rid of all the regulations, including independent testing, price gouging. It's, you know, trust us. And I remember Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. With these tech folks, it's more, I feel like, mistrust and verify. Don't assume anything they say it can be taken at face value.
Speaking of wanting to get rid of regulations, you have this shocking statistic where you say, adjusted for inflation, we are spending $100 billion more than at the height of the Cold War, yet we're getting much less. I think you say something like half the fleet in the Navy and half the planes in the Air Force as examples. How did we get to this situation where we're paying for more, but we're getting less? I know that the technology is getting more complicated, but like there's something missing there.
Well, the theory was our technology would be so much better that it would make up for the lack of numbers. But it ends up these technological marvels are very hard to maintain. They don't actually do what they're doing as advertised. So yes, there's fewer of them, but a lot of them don't actually work as advertised. And the bigger, more complicated things are better for the companies. The more complicated, the more profit. And on the F-35, Lockheed Martin controls the software for fixing it. So the government has to go begging them to fix the thing. They can charge whatever they want. even though the entire plane was funded with our tax dollars. Likewise, the nuclear arsenal, we have enough nuclear weapons to end the world many times over, and yet they're pushing full speed ahead. The new intercontinental ballistic missile was 80% over cost in the first 2 years because they thought they were going to put them in the old silos and they measured wrong. So they have to build new silos. And when it's that bad, the Pentagon's supposed to review whether we should be doing this. And they say, oh, this is much too important to slow down. But people who've been in government, like William Perry, who was Secretary of Defense, said, these are the last things we need, because in a crisis, the president has to decide in a few minutes whether to launch these things before the other side takes them out. And there's many false alarms in the history of nuclear weapons. So basically, it's an accidental war waiting to happen, and yet they're like that, behind it. So they're more complicated systems. I mean, with the volunteer army, they pay a bit more, but on the other hand, there's still people with, if you have a decent-sized family, you might be on food stamps and be in the military.